देश चिनाउने अभियान।
Namaskar, Sapile, namaskar. Thank you very much, Anita, for that very kind introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be here with you all, such a very distinguished audience this evening, as well as a very distinguished list of sponsors. I've really enjoyed your talks over the last few weeks and months even, and I'm very honored to be requested this evening to share my stories of sustainable tourism in Nepal. I thought tonight I would like to start off talking a little bit about the story of sustainable tourism and how it's developed in Nepal, why it's always been important, and in these very interesting very unique post-COVID times, it has become all the more relevant. Much of what I'm going to talk about tonight, most of what I'm going to talk about this evening, is in a pre-COVID world, because obviously that's where we've been living. But I also have, in the last 12 months, all of us have given a great deal of thought to why tourism, and indeed sustainable tourism, is important. And we'd like to share with you some of the forecasts and some of the thoughts of why sustainable tourism is really absolutely more important than ever. I'd like to start, even though I had such a lovely introduction from Anita, I'd like to start with just a little bit of background about myself. Tourism Resource Consultants, as it used to be, is based in New Zealand and Australia, and I joined bringing a private sector perspective to our New Zealand directors, who all came out of national park and natural resource management. So we work all through the Asia Pacific region, and we work specifically in those areas that indeed have a number of different names. But basically, we look at tourism sector development, we look at natural and cultural heritage management, and we are most often focusing on communities' livelihoods, poverty reduction. What we do gets lots of different names, and I'd just like to advocate that we don't get too hung up in all the different names, as long as it's the sort of tourism which creates better places for people to live in and better places to visit, that helps the community and helps conservation and the environment. That's the sort of tourism that TRC has been involved with. I've been there working with them since 1992. Many of you will know the Tiger Tops mountain travel setup. I started this evening with that cover photo of the iconic lodge, Tiger Tops Lodge, which was really one of the beginnings of sustainable tourism in Asia, not only Nepal. And I think Nepal sometimes doesn't give itself enough credit of being a real leader in this area of tourism, much admired by many other countries. Tiger Tops is a rather unique setup. It was started in the 1960s with a hunting rationale, by hunters with a conservation rationale to protect the areas of which they had been tiger hunting, and indeed rhino was originally a rhino reserve. But Tiger Tops at its height had lodges and camps all through South Asia. We worked in Bhutan and Tibet. We pioneered trekking and mountaineering in the Nepal Himalaya, and started a lot of other adventure activities, which are now such a huge part of Nepal tourism. But one thing that we can, I think, give Tiger Tops and the Tiger Mountain Group credit for was at the very beginning, they were one of the first to link the importance of tourism and conservation. Sustainable tourism, again, we have books written about the definition, but basically I would just like to propose that we assume that it's the concept of visiting somewhere and consciously making a positive impact. on the environment, on the society, and on economy. And as I said earlier, in the last year, I think with the time that we've had to reflect on nature and on how important tourism has become to Nepal, all these things have become, if anything, even more relevant. The core principles of ecotourism are as relevant today as they have always been. And let's not forget that these have also been at the heart of tourism policy in Nepal, enshrined in the strategy, the current strategy, and earlier policy documents. Tourism has always been considered a sector that should be bringing development, helping local people, alleviating poverty, as well as protecting nature and culture. And as many of our distinguished audience today are aware, the tourism industry has really led the conservation, both heritage and natural conservation in this country. The core principles are pretty simple, and I think we all agree that we're all very familiar with them, but we agree that let's not just to remind ourselves that's what really works. When we're planning tourism in other parts of Asia, and we're invited because we're taking the lessons that we've learned from Nepal over the decades, but we like to take this partnership approach where we join together the community, protected area managers, and the tourism industry, and bring it together with the overlapping circles, find reasons to work together, find projects from which people can see the other's point of view. And we look at destinations that really work in terms of making conservation, making tourism work for conservation and work for sustainability. It's when you have these three elements: understanding, trusting each other, and understanding each other's point of view. So a lot of the early exercises are finding reasons to work together and organizing around successful outcomes. I think many of you are very aware and very familiar with the values, and our chairman today, Douglas, is really a living example of how he has come at conservation from the philanthropic point of view to the business point of view. I've come at it from the other way with a business background, but these are the reasons that makes heritage and nature tourism really important, and how it can help destinations develop, achieve national objectives, make life better for local people. I think probably I don't need to talk about too many of these, because I think you'll be pretty familiar with the benefits. Dwarika's, for example, has pioneered the heritage tourism sector, and how heritage and tourism can work so well together, and have received many awards very justifiably in this area. One of the areas that perhaps isn't always thought about is that visitor behavior can be improved. The relationship between hosts and guests, it can become more comfortable. And so it's not only the person offering tourism, the hosts, whether it's a village or a lodge or a destination in the larger sense of the word, but also the visitors, the tourists, feel more comfortable if they know how to behave and what is expected of them. And especially when we're talking about remote and unusual adventure and more distant cultures and situations where people are perhaps not absolutely sure how to behave. We use tourism, and Nepal has been extremely successful in this, using tourism to upgrade facilities, to develop self-financing mechanisms for protected areas and heritage sites, as well as, of course, creating jobs, livelihoods, and developing skills. So I think today this is the most these are the most important values and Nepal has in its own way achieved great strides in each of these areas. My background when I first arrived here in the mid-1970s was Tiger Tops, this iconic jungle lodge, which has been closed now since 2012, along with the other lease concessions inside Chitwan and Bardia National Parks and the Terai National Parks. But in 1964, Tiger Tops was the first to open 4 treetop rooms, the top 4 rooms of this lodge that you see here. And from there went on, this was before the national park was established, which was not actually established until 1972. The origins of Tiger Tops are quite interesting. I mentioned before the Texas oil millionaire tiger hunters who realized what an incredibly important resource it was, a royal and rana hunting ground. It was already protected as a rhino sanctuary. It had already been identified and later became a national park and a World Heritage Site, which is how it's protected today. Tiger Tops was the first of the lodges to open in the park, not just a lodge. The idea was to have controlled tourism, meaning numbers that were manageable. We never had more than 22 rooms at Tiger Tops Lodge, and expansion took the form of camps and the Taru village operation outside the park on the edges of the park. So the actual accommodation was pretty simple, built from local materials, entirely staffed by local people. But it was a very well-crafted product with an uncompromising approach to the conservation effort, which was brought to us by Chuck Mcdougal, tiger specialist, and originally an anthropologist who came to live in Nepal in the mid-60s. Jim Edwards was the one who provided the business acumen and the marketing flair. But together they created this very unique environment of a wildlife lodge, which in its day was second to none throughout the region. They took over in 1972. Pre-1972, as I said, it was first developed in 1965. The lodge, this is a photo of the elephants. And in those days, the camps were pretty, we thought they were very comfortable, but today, sustainable tourism can offer extremely great luxury under canvas. But our lodge was never offered luxury. Even the lodge, the camp, nothing. None of us strove for what is today considered a luxurious product. The luxury and the high quality service came from the level of guiding and the knowledge of the naturalists and the ability to tell the stories, provide the interpretation of the place that people were visiting. In those days, most of our market was from North America. We had 40% North American in those days. And when the lodge and the camp became very popular, we developed the Taru Village Lodge, which is still open and operating in Nawalparasi on the edge of the national park. Again, adapting local styles and local materials, working with local people to provide a very unusual and immersive experience in what was then Royal Chitwan National Park. Tiger Mountain Pokhara Lodge, which Douglas knows well, up the hill from him, pavilions in Pokhara, was developed in the late 90s. We're on a ridgetop mountain overlooking the Annapurnas, just half an hour outside Pokhara. And the idea was to build in the local style. This is stone quarried from the local quarry in the adjacent community forest. but to provide an experience, a trekking experience for people who didn't really want to trek and who wanted a glass of wine with dinner and wanted a comfortable place to sleep. The site of the Tiger Mountain Pokhara Lodge was the first night of the royal trek when Prince Charles came trekking in the early 1981, I think I'm right in saying. And as you can see here, the lodge is oriented so that Machu Picchu is right there in the doorway. Jimmy Roberts was the person, Colonel Jimmy Roberts was the person who identified the site for Tiger Mountain Pokhara Lodge, of which I'm still a director, as Anita mentioned. But the interesting thing about Colonel Jimmy was that he was the first person to start trekking in Nepal, also in 1964. This was the very beginning of what is now an absolutely huge business. Pre-COVID was attracting over 200,000 trekkers a year, with very large number of trekking agencies and guides and porters dependent on trekking as a way of life. Colonel Jimmy was the defense attaché. He'd been in the army. He was defense attaché at the British Embassy. And when he retired, he was a well-known mountaineer. So he knew the mountains, loved the mountains, was very familiar with working with the Sherpas, and felt that this was if he enjoyed walking in the mountains on pension-paying treks, such as the British Gurkhas did in those days, why wouldn't somebody else enjoy that? So his first group of trekkers to Nepal was in 1965, a group of ladies who went, American ladies who went to the Everest region, quite stalwart and adventurous ladies. The interesting thing about trekking is it kind of started as a group activity. This is the opposite to how we see tourism developing in many other parts of the world. It started as a kind of controlled group activity, and the FITs and the individuals came later, taking advantage of the network of trails, trading trails that cobweb the Himalaya. But the way Jimmy did it was the kind of top-end trekking in camps with fully supported camps and kitchens and showers and toilets. Then following that style of trekking, the tea houses and the strings of mountain lodges that we now enjoy through the popular trek areas, especially in Everest, Annapurna and Langtang, they all followed. But the origins of trekking in those days was a much longer stay than we've got today. The average trek would be a couple of weeks. And interestingly, we had very high proportion of return trekkers, many people coming back to do another part of Nepal. Unlike today, where it tends to be the sort of instant Everest, ticking off the bucket list and racing up to Everest Base Camp and back. Lots of trends have changed, and that's just how it should be. Mountaineering, especially in this last year even, has proven that it's a valuable segment in that it is so very focused, and people will come to climb even at the expense of other priorities. They're very, very focused on the summit. They come usually for several weeks in order to achieve the high mountains. Everest by far dominates the popular peaks. And as you can see here, $3.5 million in 2019 went to Everest out of the 4.4 million royalties earned by the government. And that does not include all the salaries and all the expenses that the mountaineering and commercial companies bring to Nepal. So, of course, there's been a big hiatus since the spring of 1919 with COVID, but we did still have 8 expeditions in the autumn of last year, and we are still expecting more. So mountaineering should always be considered by the government as a very key part of the sustainable tourism industry. So just summarizing how we started, why did it work so well? Strong products. Nepal is absolutely not short of fantastic tourism assets and great attractions, mountains, the heritage, the culture, the wildlife. Bringing benefits to local people, because that's really the only way it works. It's just good business practice to work with the local people on whom your product depends. In those early days, we had to promote Nepal as a destination, seeing itself as part of a destination. And one way that we did that in a very cost-effective way was worked in partnerships with scientists, with NGOs, government, of course, and the tourism board, which we were involved in forming, and with partners in the travel industry. We also worked in partnerships with our neighbors, with Bhutan, with India. A key part of Nepal's success has always been diversifying markets, having a spectrum of markets, not only the lower budget end, but all the way through to the high spending. And sometimes there are some of these segments that I think have recently become neglected and could be usefully reinstated for sustainability. But that is something that Nepal has always been able to sell, and the trekking product is a really good example that you could be paying $500 a day for a top-end service right down to $5 a day for carrying your own gear and staying in a humble tea house. So we need to have that whole spectrum of markets. Today, social media is hugely important. We did a lot in the old days with celebrities and royalty and visitors coming, creating media and press interest. And I think it goes without saying that anything to do with sustainable tourism has to have mandatory responsible environmental standards, which means controlling emissions, looking after waste, water, energy. And the big thing, which I think sometimes gets neglected, is that sustainable tourism, two things really. One is it has to be sustainable, meaning it has to be commercially viable. There's no point in being too idealistic, but it also has to really embrace the entire industry. We've learned that, if we've learned nothing else in the last 12 months, that we can no longer afford to be niche. We have to take tourism, sustainable tourism and sustainability into the very mainstream of tourism. I don't think I need to spend too much time on the trends because this is all kind of pre-COVID, but when we first started, tiny numbers, very small number of operators, people tended to travel long distance, especially the long haul markets would stay longer and spend more. We would love to see some of that return. And with COVID, maybe people are beginning to think like that. They're not going to travel a long way just for a week. And the story before we were hit by COVID and before Visit Nepal 2020 was completely kiboshed by the pandemic, was that Nepal, yes, since the insurgency, since the earthquake, since the disasters, which are kind of part of our crisis management life here, tourism was going up in numbers, but it was going drastically down in average daily spend. So that was an issue for the industry prior to COVID. One of the things we really realized was how many people were involved in the industry. Here you see the numbers of the guides and the companies, but my goodness, there's so many people after COVID who realized that when the tourists stopped coming, that their livelihoods were impacted. And that's why we've had such a devastating effect in the last, for the last few months. we've always advocated working in partnerships, and Nepal is really good at this and has been doing it for a long time. Nepal's been really clever, and we have one of our former tourism secretaries with us tonight. It's been really clever at using the donors, using the development partners to create what Nepal needs. And we've had a lot of the big multilateral and bilateral players, including the World Bank, who were and indeed still are very involved in tourism. I should mention the British, who are really leading in the climate change debate, but we've always worked closely with the development agencies together with the key institutions within Nepal. NGOs have got their role, and I've been privileged enough to be involved in quite a lot of these projects over the years, the Ecotourism Project, Tourism for Rural Poverty Leaving Programme, Great Himalayan Trail. And as a result, Nepal has on the ground today a really impressive cadre of experienced practitioners. Some of these projects have been more successful or more effective than others, no doubt. Trying to do tourism when there's no tourists, as we've all learned, is very, very hard. But as a result, we do have institutional systems in place all through the provinces, all through the districts, all through the remote areas. We have tourism institutions in place that can work with the provincial governments, as well as having a very strong central leaders in terms of the Ministry and Tourism Board and partners in the Ministry of Forest and Environment. But we also have a lot of really good people who have walked the walk, actually done the job on the ground. And much of the successes here has been done in partnership with the responsible private sector. There is, as I said earlier, a lot of the Nepal private sector have actually led the work in sustainability and in responsible operating systems. And indeed, we've seen that in the last few months, where we've all come together to help the Tourism Board and the Ministry with the COVID protocols. I'd like to talk just a little bit about trends and what Nepal, again, has long since learned, and that we can teach others, that Nepal is not just, tourism is not just accommodation, but it's also the whole, it's not just where you sleep, it's what you do all day, it's who guides you, who your interface is with, what stories you're being told, where you spent the night before, where you're going to spend the next night. We've got some really great circuits and packaging going in Nepal, some very experienced operators. I think you'll recognize some of this, the old inn in Tansen, the famous farm. Of course, Dwarikas is one of the leaders in this. But most important, and what we come up against time and time again in the surveys and in when we're doing studies of what motivations for tourism, time and time again, people will tell us that they go to a destination, or they enjoy a destination, or they return to a destination because of the people. So the engagement with the people cannot be stressed too highly. The naturalists, the guides, the quality of the guides, the training of the guides is really important. And of course, Nepal scores very, very highly on this, because the natural hospitality of the people of Nepal is very, very much appreciated by visitors. And that's what tends to bring them back and back. Of course, there's other elements, there's so many other elements involved, but that's what brings them back. Adapting local styles not only provides a unique and unusual atmosphere for the guests, but it also brings work for the locals to use local materials, to use local transport, to build local boats, and to use the design, the materials and the styles that the locals can engage with. So so that local people can actually build, like we saw at Pokhara Lodge, they can actually use their stone and build the cottages without having complicated drawings that they can't be understood. So adapting local styles goes across the whole spectrum, as well as providing the unique experience that people are looking for. We talked a little bit before about packaging the products, putting together the mountains, the rivers, the jungles. Nepal has got really fantastic opportunities for this. Because my background in wildlife tourism, we don't need to get too hung up on this very tricky issue about elephants, but it's something that I'm really interested in and have worked with a lot in the in my career here. But basically what we want to do is provide a unique experience for guests that works for the locals. Nepal has a couple of hundred domestic elephants in captivity. If they're not used for tourism, they're going to be in trouble. And indeed, we've seen that in the last years, because it's tourists that provides the food and provides the salaries for the three people that in our case, each elephant had three people looking after it. And so my contention, having worked in the genre, is that it's really disappointing that the current global view of sort of sound bites and quick judgments is that it is cruel and unkind to be keeping domestic elephants of any kind. It's a very nuanced, very complex issue. And there's no simple solutions like releasing the elephants into the wild, because there isn't the space. The elephants need to be looked after. So I would prefer that we spend lots of energy on ensuring that the elephants that we have in captivity are well looked after, that the husbandry is of the highest standards, that they are not abused, and that they're looked after in the best way that we possibly can, and let tourism be part of that. I'm sure we can talk about that all night, so I just thought I would mention it because I know it's a hot topic in the global tourism industry. Just like if you're working in remote areas and in the mountains, it's just good business sense to work with the local people. It just makes good business sense to protect the resource on which your tourism depends. So again, I have to say, Douglas is a really good example of this. He's done exactly that. He's got, in his case, schools and community projects helping tourism to finance, working with the communities. At Tiger Tops and in the jungles, we use tourism to finance anti-poaching and advocacy for conservation, again, led by our wonderful inspirational leader, Chuck Mcdougal. Many tourism operations have an NGO or a foundation or trust associated with them. Ours was the International Trust for Nature Conservation, which is still going, of which I'm still a vice president. But that combination of philanthropy and business, as Douglas has also proved, is a really excellent model. And nobody has been more successful at it than our Ambika Ji at Dwarika's Hotel, which is really probably the best example in Asia of a hotel that is adapted and used the local style and to provide what tourists are looking for in terms of comfort and luxury. So we've done pretty well in Nepal. I think we often don't give ourselves that credit, but lots of other countries look at us and look at our experience and are and are very encouraged by it. This COVID pandemic is kind of throwing everything up in the air. So let's just be sure that where it all lands is where it's going to help us. It's hard, for example, to follow the markets. Come from a sort of marketing product development background, so I'm very keen on knowing, who the markets are going to be, and very hard to see where it's going to go. But I'm pretty convinced, as are many in the industry, that this direction of experiential, immersive, regenerative tourism, where you're non-extractive, where you're giving back, is absolutely the way that we have to go in this world that is now dominated by the climate debate and the climate crisis that we're faced with. So when tourism comes back, it needs to be, sustainable tourism needs to be at the heart of the wider tourism industry, and Nepal is actually very well placed to do that and has had lots of experience. I'd just like to sort of move on to where we are in the post-pandemic. I'm okay for a few more minutes, Anita, I think.
Yes, Lisa, ma'am. 5 more minutes.
Thank you, perfect. So I think it was Winston Churchill who said, never waste a good crisis. And being an optimist at heart, I see lots of opportunities in the post-pandemic world. But at the moment, we just have to accept that we are faced with an absolute devastating hardship, where so many people, especially the day workers, have realized that without tourists, their work is, their jobs have been so severely impacted. The figures are horrific, down 81%, especially our big markets, even though they weren't particularly high spending markets. The China, India segments that we were getting have dropped even more so. In fact, if it wasn't for Lumbini and the pilgrims, we would be looking even worse, because most of the arrivals in the early part of last year were the Lumbini Buddhist pilgrim market. We're looking at domestic and regional solutions. The outlook for Asia is pretty grim, and not just me saying this, but organizations such as PATA have done the analysis, they've run the figures. We're expecting 2021 to be just about as bad as 2020 in the tourism industry in Nepal, and indeed throughout the region. And most places, especially South Asia, is not expecting tourism to return to its normal levels until at least 2023. This is not very optimistic news, but this comes from very good market research work. Let's hope that they're wrong. Yes, there's pent-up demand, but I'm cautious about whether our traditional high-spend, long-stay markets from Asia and the West will be racing to come to Nepal when we've got, so many issues involved with the levels of the perceived level of our medical support. There are international issues which is going to slow down tourism. World aviation is going to be slow to recover. Lack of coordination and understanding between countries. I mean, even today we suffer from conflicting messages about what the regulations are and what the length of quarantine is. So clear messaging and coordination with each country is going to slow us all down, we think. But looking at what Nepal needs, let's use COVID to reset and to restart with the sort of tourism that we think that we want, and that provides the communities and the environment with what is needed. All the new products, all the spreading the benefits, all the ideas that were actually discussed as part of the Visit Nepal 2020, which of course we've had to abandon. building back greener is the kind of catchphrase, but nobody really knows whether we're going to be able to do that. We certainly are going to need some policy change and some regulations, not just in the tourism world, but also to help with this climate crisis. As the third pole, North Pole, South Pole, and then the Himalayas, we're really conscious of how, unless we can use tourism as an advocacy to reduce emissions and to become a sustainable operators, we can see, we just have to look out of the window, especially those of you in Pokhara, look out of the window and see the black mountains, the low rivers, the lack of rain, the dust, the forest fires, all the very tangible impacts of the climate crisis and climate security. We've now got a global debate on this subject. We've got COP26 coming up. We have our Sustainable Summits Conference, which I'm also involved in, being held the first couple of days of June, which will take the Hindu Kush Himalaya message on how tourism can be a solution for climate change to Glasgow. So let's use this tourism advocacy to affect change and to join that climate reform agenda. So sustainable tourism absolutely at the heart of this. Thank you. I think that's we can see here the melting glaciers where it's green where it shouldn't be green and it's black where it should be white, and we're seeing the foundations of houses cracking due to the permafrost melting. The people of Nepal are really front and central in climate crisis. I'd love to take questions. I hope that's been of interest. I have a last slide, which is I love working with young people, and I do some lectures at colleges and university, but one of the things that they actually ask me is, how can you help? So I'm just putting these up for those of you. I'm sure all of you know exactly how you can help, but this is what we say to the young people of Nepal, and indeed the people who are traveling everywhere. And I think with the pandemic, all these ideas are even more deeply rooted in people's consciousness. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.